Hello, everyone. This is Mark from ACRL in Choice. Looking at the clock, we're just about ready to get started. But before we do, I'd like to take just a second to do a quick sound check. So for those of you out there, if you're able to hear us, see us, all of that, we'd really appreciate it if you drop a quick line in either the Q&A or the chat before we get started here. And I'll ask each of our speakers maybe just to say a quick hello and where you're calling from. Would you like to start out there, Austin?
Sure, I'm Austin McLean, and I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan today, where it dipped below freezing last night, much to my dismay.
And Dr. Helvey, would you like to say a quick hello?
Yeah, this is Ken Helvey. I'm in Allen, Texas. We're about 25 miles due north of Dallas, Texas. And it is 72 degrees and sunshiny and just beautiful out there here in Texas.
Excellent. All right, we've got lots of indicators coming through that things seem to be working properly. We appreciate your feedback. And so let's go ahead and jump right in. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL in Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, which is Dissertations Development, giving students the tools to produce better outcomes, and it is sponsored by ProQuest. A quick reminder there, today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL in Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, the structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a couple of features of the webinar software. For those of you joining us today, please know that attendees are automatically muted and your cameras are disabled. So don't worry about generating background noise or anything like that. We've got that taken care of already. In addition, in the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with our presentation materials. And we're using the Q&A feature today. So if you have questions for either of our speakers, please go ahead and drop them into that Q&A module. And if you're having any technical issues, that's why we've got the chat module open. You can use that to message me directly and we'll troubleshoot whatever issue you may be having offline right there. Also note that we are recording today's program and that everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. Today, our speakers are Dr. Ken Helvey and Austin McLean. Dr. Helvey teaches doctoral courses in global education, school finance, organizational change, technology for education professionals, the superintendency, and master's courses in school leadership and technology. He's a senior associate with N2 Learning, where he serves as a consultant in area schools in strategic planning, community-based accountability, bond planning, and other education initiatives. Dr. Helvey has successfully led numerous change processes through strategic planning, curriculum and master planning, technology planning, program analysis for budget development, and a tax ratification election. He earned his undergraduate degree from Tarleton State University and his master's degree in educational administration from Texas A&M Commerce, and received his doctoral degree from the University of North Texas. Austin McLean, our second speaker, oversees a team that ensures universities have opportunities to maximize the dissemination of their PhD and master's theses through the ProQuest Dissertations and Theses Global, PQDT Global database. Austin also works in areas of scholarly communication and digital preservation at ProQuest. He serves as treasurer of the Network Digital Library of Theses and Dissertations, a nonprofit group dedicated to sharing knowledge and best practices for electronic theses and dissertations. Austin is a frequent speaker at library conferences, having presented at the American Library Association Conference, ETD 2019 and US ETDA 2019. Austin holds a master's degree, certificate in telecommunications, economics, policy, and science from Northwestern University, and a bachelor's degree from DePauw University. All right, so with that, we are ready to get started, and I will turn things over to Dr. Helvey.
Thank you so much, Mark. And on behalf of everybody, Mark, Austin, Lynette, Jess, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. Your work on this has been exemplary. You've been such a big help as I worked through this. And it was probably a good thing I asked Jess before we got started. Okay, Jess, how did we get here? And she was able to remind me, okay, well, this was our journey. So I'll probably mention that as we go of how we got there. But it's great to be with you and talk about something that is certainly important to me and to should be for any doctoral professor, is really leveraging whatever strategic ideas, strategies, and actions we can to help students complete the dissertation, because that's generally where the biggest bottleneck and or inhibitor of the student is for completing that. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about our university, but I'm also going to talk quite a bit about my journey, which I think frames to some extent what I was able to bring to the team, to our university, in looking at ways to improve our process in order for us to achieve the highest achievement rate we can possibly achieve with our students getting their dissertations. So we're going to talk about our university, and then of course go through the details of the things we did, but not only the strategic thinking part, but then also move to the strategic action component of it, the things that we did, and how that connected us intentionally to the library in a way that was far more applicable, actionable, and consistent and relevant than what we had been doing before that. And I would say, quite personally, what I experienced as a doctoral student. So those are our outcomes for the day, is to look at why we shifted our philosophy, and the what. I mean, they're basically the why and the what we did to do that, and then that connection to the library. And I'm going to share my screen so I can operate my own deck here. Go to full screen there for you. I retired as a school superintendent, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, back in 2014, and really just almost by luck landed on this little university in the southeast part of Fort Worth, Texas Wesleyan University. And you can see our numbers on the screen, but we're a small private university, which I think gives us a great deal of advantages with working with doctoral students. And we on the average have about 50 plus that we're working with at any point in time. And I would say, as a side note to this, the pandemic has definitely shifted our thinking into transformation in regard to how can we continue to be relevant. And I would say probably most private universities are having that conversation while maintaining that personalized connection that we pride ourselves on with our doctoral students. The interesting thing about our student profile is we're in a very impoverished part of Fort Worth, and the majority of our students are African-American and Hispanic teachers from the local urban schools, Fort Worth ISD, Dallas ISD, and different ones. And many times, and a lot of them are women, because naturally when you come from the education community, particularly the K-12 world, it's primarily women, but we have several students that are in higher ed that are from the community college level that are pursuing their doctorate as well. So it's very inspiring to work there, because a lot of our students were first generation undergraduates and definitely first generation graduate students, and they're managing work, and of course managing teaching virtually and face-to-face right now is even a bigger challenge. So they have incredible challenges. So I think that probably fed our motivation to a great extent on why it was important that we strategically think about how do we transform our program from what would be considered a traditional opportunities-based program to more of a coaching-based program. So I think, as you see when I talk about kind of my journey, you'll kind of see how this materialized. Of course, the big thing is the whole goal is to improve graduate student outcomes. Those of us that are in the graduate level world for doctoral students know the division between making it and not making it is the dissertation. The dissertation is such a different animal than anything else you do. Generally, students can do well in coursework. They know how to do school because they've been in school for many years. They teach in schools, many of our students do. They understand how to do school. But how to do research is a completely different animal. And as I'll mention again later, a lot of our students, they have been out of it for a while, so they're back in the game. So to make an assumption that I think, certainly when I was a student, and I'll reinforce this later, make an assumption that I have all these skills necessary to jump into this is really a false assumption. So this is our why, but a little bit about me. I'll talk about my experience, and this is not a knock on my graduate university. They did a great job, and I love working with them. I've done adjunct work for them before at the University of North Texas, but I would categorize it as a very traditional experience as far as I went through the coursework. At the time, I was either an assistant superintendent or a school superintendent, and we went through the coursework, we went through the contact, we did different activities. But at no time in the coursework experience was there ever an engagement in conversation about the study that I plan to do. It was like, that's just something you'll do when you're done with your coursework. Very little, if any, time on, even though there were a few research papers, there were a few, but nothing that was connected to what I might be interested in, and no real coaching conversations to that. So what that ultimately did was it kind of left me to fend for myself, like many do. As soon as the coursework was over, I looked up colleagues that had already finished and said, okay, what do I do now? How do I find the information? How do I structure this? What does a dissertation look like? Multiple questions. And of course, I finally made it through it. But I would have to say it was more as a result of coaching from colleagues than from the university that I was going to. And again, I don't mean to be critical, but that's just kind of the way things were done, particularly, and that was in the mid-2000s at that time. I'm absolutely sure they have improved upon that, as many universities have. So that was my experience. So I knew what my experience was. And then as an educator, there were several other things. First of all, for most of my education career, I was in the central office and usually in some type of role in strategic development. Sometimes it was strategic development or strategic action as a result of a crisis, budget cuts, mismanagement of funds or something like that, where we were brought in to come in and right the ship financially, culture changes, things like that. So I got accustomed to my DNA being very much part of having a CEO mentality of always kind of looking at the big picture, looking at why are things happening the way they are? What is our real why here? And is what we're doing the most beneficial thing to that? So I think that was very helpful. And another thing that was helpful was the fact that I had that experience moving into a graduate professor. This is something I highly recommend to everybody. If you ever get a chance to retire from your job and then go do a job that you really just enjoy, that really doesn't have many of the other things that you may not have enjoyed that much, I recommend doing that. Well, that's what I was able to do. I retired after 31 years in public education and said, you know what, I've been doing some adjunct work. I was incredibly interested in learning, in research, and evaluating research, evaluating strategically, and helping other practitioners. So I became a professor. But I think the key to that was once I got into that, I was no longer interested, just like I talked to my dean, I'm not interested in being the dean. I'm not interested in being any other thing. So it allowed me to really focus with my colleagues on, with a new set of eyes. So let's say, okay, what do we need to do here? By position, I was developed into not looking in the weeds. Most of my job was always above the weeds, looking at what are the things we need to do. So that kind of gives you a context of my journey to get to the point where when we could sit in a room and talk about, and I could ask those questions and quite honestly not feel like I was hopefully not offended anyone. And I can tell you our culture is so cooperative there at our university, which is very helpful. You have to have that. Everyone was ready to embrace the idea of, okay, let's tear this apart. Let's look at this. Let's do some strategic thinking as we move forward. And that's what I want to move to next is those early meetings we had, and we're talking back in 2015, we started looking at, okay, what are the issues we're dealing with? This was our strategic thinking deep dive. And as we're working around the room, we're starting to say, well, here are certain research skills that are just not there when our students get there. And as I mentioned before, remember the profile of the student we get for the doctoral program, they're generally practitioners, and the education doctorate is a practitioner degree. Problem is, it has been years since they've been in a research academic setting. So to make an assumption that they were ready when they got there was a false assumption. So we thought, well, can we do this in another way? So we started talking about the deficiencies, the research skills. And that's important because research skills 10 years ago, there are so many better tools now that that definitely is probably a different conversation than it would have been 10 years ago. And then an example, we listened theoretical framework when one of the professors saying, you know, we expect them to design their study around a theoretical framework. Most common question I'm getting from a doctoral student is, what's a theoretical framework? Even 2 years into the coursework, that I still don't get it. I still don't understand that. And part of it was because they really had never seen one that much and really didn't understand. So there had to be there was an issue there. Dissertation structure. What in the world does this thing look like? How's it organized? All these types of things. Where we knew these deficiencies were in there, and we listed them all. And like I say, as we did this deep dive. And then, of course, the advent of tremendous reference, organization, and management tools. And there's more than one, obviously. We're going to talk about, or I'm going to mention RefWorks is the one our university supports here, but there are numerous others, and we certainly don't limit our students. We do whatever's comfortable for you or whatever works best in your technology environment. But so those improved technology applications just really made it. And then the idea we need to start early and often and throughout the process. So this was our kind of our deep dive of strategic thinking. And then that moves us into strategic action. So we decided that we looked at, well, what are the things that we need to do? We need to better prepare students to conduct a study. And that was going to involve from the start, if that involved changing the curriculum, if that involved restructuring the schedule of courses, whatever it may be. And if there's any one word I could emphasize over and over and over, and will emphasize over and over, is the concept of relevance. What keeps our students engaged? What keeps them keeping their eye on the prize is that term relevant. So we need to integrate relevant instructional time in a timely process. So and I'll talk into the details in just a moment on how we did or what we did to do that. But that relevance is critical. To give an example of my library experience in higher ed might have been someone from the library, which first of all, I'm going to repeat this later, but there's two things I can say about my experience with higher education libraries. One, they are rich in resources, and two, they are absolutely dying to help. And a lot of my experience has been, they'll come in, they'll give you a presentation, but what they really want is tell me what your needs are, and that way I can really help you. Well, you don't really know your needs till you create relevance, and that's what we tried to do in that second bullet there. And then this was a game changer for our students, the number 3. Prior to changing and shifting our philosophy, we had a very traditional process of you take the coursework and then we're going to put you through 2 grueling days of tests or essay questions regarding your coursework that you've taken over 3 or 4 years. Now, everybody's got their opinion on this, but my opinion is that was totally runs afoul of good assessment processes. To expect someone to regurgitate a quality essay from a school finance course they took 3 years ago, yeah, they can do a good job and they can fill it out. But when you really ask the question, how does this really relate to the next step? Because the whole purpose of that assessment was to determine, are you ready to engage in a study? So we had to ask ourselves that hard question of, okay, what do we need to do? Well, we need to transform our entire process that leads them to a comprehensive pre-proposal. We call it a qualifying experience, but the whole point is once they get to that last semester of their coursework, they are going to submit something they've been building since the day one, building that first 3 chapters of their study, well researched and not fully developed, but close, and submit that. And that would determine, yes, in fact, you're ready to move forward, or no, in fact, you're not. And we'll emphasize this later, but the library, of course, the resources that became critical to this ongoing process for the students. So that was our strategic action that we took. And I want to make sure, just looking at my notes, that I haven't forgotten anything that I really wanted to emphasize here. I think one thing is the fact that all of these things were intentional. We probably in the past, some of us were hitting theoretical framework, or we were doing some on reference organization, but none of us really knew when that was happening. So all this was going to be intentional. And then we'll talk a little more detail about this process of mapping of the curriculum. And I think this reflects a bit back to my experience as a CEO and also as a strategic planner. If you heard in the intro that I also do strategic planning with school districts, and we're doing it virtually now, by the way. But one of the things that we talk about is it gives us that experience of looking at, okay, let's look at all your systems, just look at what are we doing across the board and where is it happening and where do we need to make adjustments. So we started with, we just took a simple word table, we put the courses all across there, and we identified those major skills that are needed in order for students to be successful, not only for that qualifying experience, but to complete a study. Because we knew if they put a quality product together for pre-proposal, they got a proposal done within 3 months. A year later, they're going to have their doctorate, almost 100% of the time. So we knew this is something we did. So we get in a room and we do this matrix and we put all these skills in. And by the way, I know they're going to show you some resources that came from some things that I did, but you'll notice the rubric used to assess a superintendent, assess a dissertation, are really the same topics that came up in this matrix. And what we discovered says, okay, if they're only seeing the concept of theoretical framework in one course in year 1 or year 2, that's not enough. This has got to be across the curriculum. So it allowed us all to look at one picture and say, where are the research skills that they're missing and where are we emphasizing these? A good example happened last night in the class I had last night. We were going over some work that the students had done. They had enhanced their study through a specific angle. And I had a student send me a message that said, okay, is it okay if I submit part of this of work that I did in Dr. G's class? Because it's completely relevant and it's exactly what you're, and I said, absolutely fine. There's no use in reinventing the wheel. If I already know you've done this and you can do this, I don't need to make you do it again. And it really made me feel better that there's some overlap occurring in the places that we want to occur. So we did that first. And one of the things we did was we made sure those dissertation instructions are reinforced in every class, regardless of the content. And every professor's got that capacity to adjust their work in order to do that. And of course, we continually in our meetings define the gaps. But here's what probably, and I use the term game changer, but we decided, okay, at the time we had a course, and it's still called the same thing. It's called Technology for Education Professionals. And for those of you that are in the higher ed world, you'll know you got to be careful about you begin to change much in a course without having to go through a substantial amount of bureaucracy to get it done. Well, it turned out that the objectives for this course were written pretty broadly. So I completely transformed that course to technology applications relevant to the dissertation. So the entire syllabus, and we're teaching this course, it comes up next semester. The entire syllabus is about all of these technical and capacity building, these skill level things to help build capacity that get them on the road to this. This is where the library comes in so importantly. Then of course, it made sense in that next next text box you see is at the time we were teaching the course. Well, let me give you a real quick, what was it before? Before it was about technology applications for education, just a very broad, almost seminar type thing. Just, and again, if you think about it, for most of us, and it's true of adult learning theory, it's true of adolescent learning theory. If it's not entirely relevant, it's probably forgotten information pretty quickly. That's pretty much what that course was. So we shifted to this and said, okay, if these are going to be the foundational things that are going to catapult them through the next 3 to 4 years of their study, we need to move that right up front. So our first cohort takes this class. So it not only engages them in the library, it engages them in a purposeful type process. Again, the main thing is relevance. So the first thing I will do when we start in the spring won't be a technology related activity. It will be a activity say, okay, we need to identify, or you need to identify a problem. What is a problem? How do you know it's a problem? Now, this is a side note that you'll probably hear from the ProQuest folks later, but I'm pretty sure I saw a module that they're doing that is going to actually help with that. And I'll emphasize this later, but that they've developed some modules that are going to pretty much build a lot of my curriculum for next semester. So I really appreciate that. But we got to start with that. Say, okay, you got an idea of a problem. And most of the time they'll come to the table with some type of problem of practice, something they're seeing in their daily life, something they're seeing in their daily work life. But we begin to look at it from a research standpoint of, is it really a problem? Who says it's a problem? How do you find out whether it's a problem? So we spend some time early on. Then that relevance kicks in. Now we can engage the library from a relevance perspective, not just, okay, here are things the library can do. And that's really how this conversation got started with Jess and I. Jess ran into one of my students some time back and said, here's something we're doing in this class, and we got connected. Well, again, this was before I had really engaged my colleagues and said, okay, well, one thing I see is I'd like to see where those exemplary examples are of dissertations. But not only that, you might want to look at one that's related to your problem of practice. And then ProQuest came to mind. So that's kind of how we got to this point. And it's just built on that so much of, okay, now it's become a staple part of that course of being to look at how do we do this. And I'll talk more about that later. Again, that I'm going to keep emphasizing the relevance is that glue that connected us to the library. It's completely the whole thing. And that's really where I want to go to next is how that research library, how they really helped. Because again, as I said, it's that glue that pulled us in there. It's that connection to consistent engagement with the library resources that are so valuable and helpful. And as I mentioned before, I know this about libraries. They have a lot of resources and they're so willing to help. And in fact, we talked earlier about, and I'm sure you have out there in the audience have talked to them, what are some things that are happening in the pandemic that we're doing now that will probably be effective afterward? If there's ever an afterward, I'm sure there will be. But and one of the things is our capacity to connect. I connect more with doctoral students now through coaching conversations than I did before. And I think now it's because it's so convenient. Well, the same thing we're going to do, I'll talk about that, we can do with the library, is we can bring in those library staff people that are experts so much more conveniently than we could before. And I'll talk about improvements we're looking at in the future as we move toward that. Let's see. Specifically on the library support, again, once the students begin to develop their problem of practice, and once we establish, okay, and I'd give them feedback and say, okay, I think you got a real problem or a real practice to look at. It might be social emotional learning. It might be recruitment strategies for quality educators. It might be related to discipline management practices or the value of professional learning communities, whatever it may be. of the numerous topics that they come up with that are passionate about them. And we know this about the dissertation. There's a relationship between the passion level you have for the topic and your completion rate. So you want them to have something they're passionate about, but then get down to that practical conversation. Okay, is it worthy of study? And is there a way to study that particular problem? Well, the way we did it, we know the library has substantial databases. We've known that. What a lot of our students do is realize how much reference management support that you can find, not only elsewhere, but most libraries are going to have some type of system, RefWorks, Zotero, or even all of your databases themselves have import-export capabilities or their own management system. So we thought, how outstanding if we connect with that library first and they begin to develop their inventory of resources, their inventory of sources. A big reason for doing that problem of practice first is so that it narrows to some extent where they need to look. It's just not a shotgun approach. That brings me to, like, specifically in the technology class, the dissertation assessments. That's down at the bottom under specific activities from the technology course. One of the first things, what we do throughout the whole semester, and they have to do 10 of them, is I use a template to say, okay, I want you to go find a dissertation each week, or at least through 10 weeks, that represents something related to your problem of practice. And then I add components to it as we go. So, okay, this time I want you to find a qualitative dissertation. This time I want you to find a quantitative. This time I want you to find one that has a different theoretical framework than what you had anticipated before. So you start adding components. Well, you can see now where, okay, in order to get that detailed, we're going to need to get really specific on capacity building for using ProQuest, which, again, a little bit of an advertisement for them. They're going to talk about that later, and that's going to be a real help to these students. Is now we're going to have a module, and I appreciate the fact Jess and I talked a long time ago about it. And she said, well, what could we do to improve this? And I said, well, if you had some type of module or video to really help them enhance those skills for ProQuest, that would be a big help. And I think that then say, well, I'm excited about that when we move to that, to that. So what we do is they're looking at those dissertations, and then I say, okay, within those dissertations, I want you to begin to import, export, and begin to create your inventory of sources from the start. So when you get to that dissertation, we get to that pre-proposal, you're not starting over. You are designing this. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a struggle for students because a lot of times what they think they wanted to study at first may change a bit as you go through. So you spend a lot of time, each of the professors do over the first couple of years, really in those coaching conversations. Okay, are you sure you want to go that direction? But after a while, you need to start getting close so you're using your time wisely in the research setting. Again, that ongoing database, and then various embedded research activities. So each course, for example, will do some type of research activity that's specifically related to that. Again, they got to have those capacity building skills as they move through that. How am I doing on time? If Austin or Mark, if you tell me.
Hi.
Great, you're doing.
We are doing well. We're at 2:33 right now.
So, okay, we're pretty close.
Minutes.
I just want to make sure I'm not like way off here or something. Thank you. Continue on library support. Here's a good example. When I would ask them to do, for example, a dissertation assessment, I would go beyond that and say, okay, you're going to do this assessment and you're going to fill out the template and you're going to complete all of the activities about it. But I also want to mandatory that you use a reference management software to not only embed that or keep record of that particular dissertation, but to also any additional resources and I may get specific on that and say what resources were used for theoretical framework or something like that. Begin to develop that database so it becomes a final project into the course of, okay, I want to see, I actually make them say, I want to see your screenshots. I want to see where you put this. And so you may choose to use another option later, but for this course, I want to clearly see you're using a technology application and using the tools available to you. And of course, ProQuest Dissertations and Thesis Global is a big, is one of the big resources that they use. The library helps us tremendously through direct instruction. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be a little bit easier this coming spring because I know our library staff of each area that we'll be able to just pop in as we have our face-to-face, because we still have fast, even in COVID, we still do face-to-face, but it's face-to-face virtually, it's not physical. So I anticipate that will continue. And so anyway, there'll be good opportunities for that. And of course, we do webinars and virtual workshops. Again, I can't emphasize enough of how much this has really been super helpful for us. And our results are good. Of course, the national average can be, as you can see, at the 50% level. We've gotten all the way up to 80%, had a little dip in 2020, but we anticipate that's going to continue to go up. Because, and I guarantee it's all about relevance, and it's all about building on those capacities and not making an assumption that they have them to start off with. And we're very proud of that. And we feel like this is what's going to keep us relevant in regard to, we may convert to a fully online system sometime in the future. But even in a fully online doctoral degree, we will still have our face-to-face interaction. And I mentioned it earlier, but I think what's happened is the engagement with the students has become, again, less of a direct teach piece and more of a coaching piece, which is kind of natural when you figure the information that's available to us out there now. In K-12, we've known this all along, and I think higher ed's, same way of we are becoming much more facilitators of skill development than we are, direct teach in many of the cases, especially at the graduate level. So I want to close with really the shifts that have occurred. Of course, we've had enhanced engagement because of the relevancy. I can't emphasize that enough. Student confidence levels, you can see that quote at the bottom. Assessing dissertation performance made me realize I can do this. And the great feedback that we get from them as we're looking at dissertations, they begin to be able to evaluate and say, you know what, I looked at this one and it's not very good. And I give them credit and say, you know what, that's just as important to find a dissertation that you see has some deficiencies. That tells me that you're beginning to understand this. But I think the big thing is they see it, this is a doable exercise, and they see that structure over and over and over. And one of the big benefits that we've seen, that's one of the bigger challenges of this dissertation, I can give you a pretty good formula as the professor for chapter 1 and chapter 3 and 4 and 5. But chapter 2 is wide open. It's the literature review. It's the research. It's your proof that you are an expert in that subject. That's where the library is critical right there, is being able to provide those resources so they can build a truly expert level case with that. And improved virtual defense. Our defenses are so much richer now. We do them by virtual now instead of face-to-face. Again, that's a little bit down because they're usually a celebration type thing. But so it's not quite as celebratory as when they're virtual. But there are things that we want to improve on. One of the things I was just thinking and reflecting on it today, and I think ProQuest is going to really help us out with this, is the problem identification part. That concept itself is not well understood when students come in, and that's understandable. They haven't really had to think of things from that perspective, from a research perspective. So I think they're going to be able to help us out with that, with some of the tools they're going to talk about. But I'm really going to hit on that first. But that's one thing we're going to have to improve on. Their skills to use ProQuest. now that they're getting to a point, okay, I know my problem, but I want to really, I'm going to up the standard to some extent on those dissertation assessments, which will require them to be able to be much more discerning about what they're finding. Because right now, I think they have a fairly surface level understanding of the power of the ProQuest. After the first 2 to 3 weeks, I expect them to have a pretty advanced understanding, and that's going to help them get down to that narrow set of studies that they need to look at. And then improving their evaluation skills of those dissertations as they get to it. So that's my story. That we feel in our department that has been highly successful. Again, we have a great advantage we have a great culture of collaboration. We're small, so we can be. We're in constant connection with who's doing what when, and I've just very much appreciated ProQuest's help with this and look forward to our work in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Helvey. That was very, very interesting, very helpful. You're going to be a hard act to follow, I'll tell you that. So I'm going to start sharing my slides. If you would stop sharing yours, and I'll be able to move right into that. The next section about talking about the ProQuest
right
resources.
there you go.
Great, thank you. So the key thing that we're going to talk about today is the ProQuest resources that are free that will help graduate researchers. So hopefully people can see my screen, and I'm going to go into presentation mode. All right, can folks see my screen in full screen mode?
Hi, Austin. It doesn't look like it has gone over to full screen.
Okay, let's see. Why is that? Let me do this one more time. Here we go, onto full screen mode. Is that any better?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about picking up this the piece that Dr. Helvey was talking about, how ProQuest is supporting grad students. And specifically what we want to talk about is the student pain points. And over the past year at ProQuest, we conducted extensive research with graduate students to identify pain points in the graduate process. And our discovery led to the identification of 4 pain points. There were quite a few, but these 4 really stood out. First of all, students want to understand what works have been produced under their advisor, what kind of dissertations and theses their advisor has advised. They want to understand the areas of past focus that their advisors worked on. They would like to find examples of dissertations that were deemed suitable for awarding a degree that their advisor worked on. And they also want to know, is my advisor experienced in the area that I'm going to be working on or would like to work on? Secondly, they wanted to understand the qualities of a well-written dissertation. So the authors wanted to determine an exceptional dissertation versus one that's merely acceptable, and as Dr. Helvey was talking about. They don't want to identify a dissertation that makes an exemplar in their field, something that they can aspire to writing for themselves. Thirdly, the dissertation authors identified determining a niche topic and what research questions were outstanding in the field. So once they determine a topic, it's really then important to think about the areas of study within that topic that they would write on. They need assistance in determining how to focus their research in that niche topic. And finally, the pain point they identified was developing a literature review for proposal writing. So what that means, they told us, is they want to understand the context of their contribution to understanding the research problem that's being studied. They wanted to describe the relationship of each work to the others in their consideration of the proposal in their topic area. And they wanted to identify new ways that they could interpret prior research. And of course, a key element is going through that literature review and finding gaps in the existing knowledge base. So at ProQuest, we took those 4 areas and then created the self-directed e-learning resources that I'm going to talk to you about that are free for you to use. But we identified how we could create these and how they would be successful. First, we wanted to make sure that they were LMS compatible. And that was very important. So these learning modules that we've created have SCORM files that can be uploaded into the learning management system that's being used in your university. So these are really portable, really transferable. Second, we wanted to identify the modules that would be used by students in an on-demand capacity. We wanted to make sure that they did not need instructional guidance, the students that is, to move through the modules. And we're really glad that we did this because it became more important in the spring when many universities went to online learning, potentially exclusively online learning. We also wanted to follow learning design best practices. And well, what does that mean? Well, interactivity is a key component of these best practices. We wanted to make sure that the author felt engaged as they were using them. And an assessment component is really important as well because it improves information retention when these are interactive modules. And we also wanted to make sure that we were improving learning outcomes. That's obviously a best practice. We know that interactivity and some of these other practices help with that as well. And finally, we wanted to make sure that the graduate program resources that we're developing could be integrated into a program, as Dr. Helvey talked about, or into potentially a new class that could be developed. So with those criteria in mind, we developed these e-learning companions for graduate students. We relied on Dr. Helvey and his great success in his program to help us design these, as well as Dr. Jan Allen at Cornell, who was integral in this creation of these e-learning modules. So we essentially had 3 modules come out of this process. The first one, getting started with your dissertation or thesis, revolved around topic selection, a critical area, as Dr. Helvey mentioned. Authors want to know how to select a topic and what is the process for completing a dissertation or thesis once a topic is selected. Our second module focused on efficient discovery and research curation and search tips for research tools. So we wanted to pick up on those topics that Dr. Helvey talked about, which is how do you perform basic or advanced research searches? How do you curate tools to help build a literature review, for example? And in the third module, we focused on developing a writing plan. This is absolutely critical as well, because you can do all the research and all the literature review as possible, but if you do not have a writing plan that forces you to focus and really lays out this research and writing process, it's really going to be a very difficult process to write your dissertation or your thesis. So these best practices and overcoming obstacles are really important, particularly now that people are doing more writing, most likely at home during these COVID times. We also developed learning aids, and you can see the one on the right, the assessment rubric that Dr. Helvey was instrumental in helping us work on. What that does is it helps a student as they navigate through the dissertation and puts up questions for them to think about as they assess a dissertation or a thesis. We also created writing plan examples to create this framework by which authors are creating their writing process and their writing program. And also efficient discovery and research curation tips were very important for authors as they go about working through their literature review. So right now I'm going to switch gears a bit and show the e-learning modules directly to you that you'll be able to sign up for shortly. I'm going to focus on module 2, so if you could let me know if you can see module 2, which is this efficient discovery and research creation. Can everybody see that?
Yes, Austin, it looks good.
Great, thank you. So you'll see in module 2 what we started to do, or what we strive to do with all the modules, all 3 modules, is to make them very interactive. And our partner, O'Donnell Learn, just did a fabulous job in creating these with us and making them very sticky and very interactive for the students. So you'll see the student can go through the module, they'll learn about how to construct a Boolean search. They can use these interactive components to work through the questions and the research activities. they have these interactive modules that you can plug into your assessment exercise and your best practices as well. Some of these are coming up on the screen now. So for example, you could learn about how to work on a research problem and then test yourself. So here's an example of how you test yourself. You drag these items that coordinate to the different areas, and then you can test to see if you're right or wrong. Oh, I did those incorrectly. Boy, I hope your students are better. But the good part is that they can continue to work and continue to refine these sections until they get the proper outcome, and they can go back to them and try them again and again. So we hope that you will be able to look through these modules, all 3 of them, and understand how they fit with your current process, or if you would like to augment your process and weave in any of these 3 modules along with some of the other components that you probably have on hand already. So as a next step, I'll show you how to get back and sign up for these modules. And then we can get to your questions and answers. If you go to the URL below, you'll be able to get access to these e-learning modules, as well as to go through the questionnaire that we have for you at the conclusion of the webinar. But luckily, we have 10 minutes of time that you can ask questions for Dr. Helvey or for myself to learn more about these. I saw some questions were coming in already, so I'll stop now talking and bring Dr. Helvey back to make sure to have time to answer as many of your questions as we can before the hour concludes. So Dr. Helvey, welcome back.
I'm here.
Great.
Hi, Austin, and Jess is here. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing all that great information. And that link that's on the slide is also been posted. Lynette put it in the chat, so you can go directly to it from the chat field as well. And those modules are all free. You can download the SCORM files to upload to your LMS, as Austin mentioned. We have a lot of great questions coming in, so I hope we have a good amount of time. I have a similar question Mandy and Kim asked for you, Dr. Helvey. As an academic librarian, they feel that they can suggest a lot of integration of various levels of research and dissertation prep skills over time. How would you recommend they get traction with the faculty on these suggestions? How did you kind of get engaged at that level?
I saw that question and my first thought was, damn, I wished I had a quick answer for that. But, you know, I don't think that's an easy answer because a lot depends on several factors. First, what kind of culture exists? And I think that's important. What kind of culture exists in the department in the particular area? For example, if it is the education department, and particularly the doctoral program of the School of Education, is it a very collaborative culture? Is it the type of culture that is looking to improve? If it's a toxic culture that is kind of off on their own, it really has no interest in coming together, I would say your chances of success are minimal, if anything. I would suggest at least do some assessment first to find out, okay, where is the university in its current state? What does the data tell them about their success in regard to particularly this issue of doctoral success? If they're already highly successful, the sense of urgency may not be there. But if there's a real issue, it might be worthwhile to engage a key communicator of that group and say, okay, what kinds of things are you talking about? And I think that's one of the things that I had a bit of an advantage because, again, I came in from retiring from K-12, doing this job because I love it, because that's what I want to do. And I was that new guy that was able to come in and say, without, really making too many people mad, because I was the new guy, I said, well, why are we doing this? We'd have these advisory meetings and you're required to have all these meetings. So why are we talking about this? How does this contribute to what we're supposed to be doing? And Hopefully they're asking those questions. So I know I wish I could have given somebody a quick answer, but I said, I'd say gather data first, because as we know, it's got to groundswell from those professors to the library. If it's something top down from the dean through them, it's probably not going to work. K-12 is no different. Top down decisions typically fall flat unless it's some kind of life safety thing. But generally, when it's a behavior change toward philosophy and culture, it needs to come from the ground up. So hopefully you've got a key communicator that you can talk to and gather some information and say, okay, what kinds of conversations are you having? What kinds of issues are you running into? And then maybe it would be, okay, here's a proposal, and hope maybe something from this webinar helped out. You can say, okay, here are some things people are doing that you might consider to really cover those deficiencies that you may be seeing.
Great, thank you, Ken. We had another question about the rubric you were showing earlier. I think several people wanted to maybe have you talk through that in a little bit more detail. Would you mind doing that?
Oh gosh, I need to bring it up because I can't see it on that screen very well. Let me look at my PowerPoint to see if I can see it better. That was on slide
18.
10, right?
Or,
Yeah. Okay, let me see if I can see it a little better. Okay. When we identified these areas that we knew needed to be embedded across the curriculum, and I noticed a comment where it said, so essentially what you're doing is backwards design. You're exactly right. That's exactly what we were doing. And, this I don't mean for this to sound critical, but in my experience with higher ed as an adjunct and a professor, curriculum design and mapping are not on top of people's list. In K-12, it has to be. So I came into an understanding of, okay, well, how can you actually feel like we're being effective unless we're really understanding what's happening when? So these were areas that were identified by the group and said, okay, here are the things we're seeing that are a problem. And to start with the problem description, as Austin was telling about, we're saying, well, they don't really understand how to describe a problem. So we said, well, let's engage, part of the dissertation process, let's let them evaluate how they, finding that problem. Theoretical framework was a big one because nobody knew what that was. Now, when students turn in papers, they know exactly what it is. They know where it is. They know how to draw the conceptual model. So that's been covered. But these early students, that dives them right into it, because usually you really get that look of, okay, I don't even recall ever hearing this term. But and interestingly, not all dissertations have a theoretical framework. It's not necessarily some standard requirement everything. I would say most good ones do, but they do find that, okay, so this one didn't have one. So, and then you can say, as a part of the assignment, only choose a dissertation that has one. The methodology, they go through the methodology, and then this rubric, of course, is dynamic. Each time as they start to get much better, you can change this a little bit to make it a little more challenging of looking at the methodology or a specific methodology. And of course, articulation and response is where we really bring in, again, nobody writes APA until they become a doctoral student. Maybe a master's level, some, maybe a little, and a lot of times undergraduates still in some other. So one of the things that's aside from this, but our library helps us with providing resources to learn how to write an APA. So we begin to assess them early on in their writing style. And I'm so glad Austin pointed out that last module was going to be related to writing, because that's a challenge too if you don't address that early on. And I think, again, we need to look at it from a standpoint, they hadn't done it for a long time. It's a technology you haven't done forever, and it's a different kind of writing, especially in today's world. A lot of them are used to doing blogs or something like that. So it's a very different type of writing, but we use that, and that goes in Blackboard, and their work is assessed based on that. And then we usually have, during the face-to-face, we have some shared time and reflection. good learning really is the result of reflection on the learning, not the learning itself. So I think that activity, when we come back together, even virtually, when they begin to look at, okay, what dissertation did you find? And we can do groups with Collaborator, Zoom, or whatever you're using. They go back over the rubrics together and reflect on it. So.
Wonderful, thank you, Dr. Helvey. I think, so we had a couple questions on whether your improvement upon your dissertation completion rates has been published anywhere. Has your university?
No,
put
it
that out
hasn't, but
there?
we probably need to do that.
Okay.
I think I'm good idea to somebody out there. So we need to do that.
And I think that puts us at time, though. There are other really great questions in here.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Helvey, and thank you so much, Austin, for walking us through the modules and for talking us through all of this information. This is Mark from ACRL in Choice, for those of you listening in out there. I would just say thank you to all of you for joining us today. We appreciate your taking the time to join us and to participate in the webinar. As you sign out here, if you have a minute or two to just fill out a real quick survey, we would appreciate your doing so. It should pop up on your web browser. And if you could just give us a little feedback, we'd really appreciate that. At this point, I think we will just say, we hope to see you in the near future on another webinar. Thanks so much for your time.